thank God. Engine side. Thursday morning, the new flex plate came in that I needed to bolt the transmission back up to the engine, and I was determined that I was going to get this thing stuck back in the car today. But I had a few goals for the day. I wanted to get the transmission, the flex plate, the torque converter all assembled and make sure everything was within clearance. I wanted to get my steering set up and fixed finally, and I wanted to see if I could get the new ATI harmonic super balancer that I got installed on the car. I picked up a little bit of extra brake fluid, and I also picked up a couple other things, brake clean and a harmonic balancer installer. As normal, Daisy was at the shop to welcome me. I wanted to get the trans put in, but first I figured I'd get the steering sorted out on the car. I bought a steering joint, but since I was planning on using the stock steering column because I wanted to have a street car, I knew I was going to have to fabricate a way to fix it to the car. So I cleaned up a piece of round tubing that had the same outside diameter as the inside diameter of the steering rack and started testing it and fitting it around to see what I could do. That way I could attach it properly and get rid of the stock rack joint. Okay, so what I got here is, I'll grab the other. Most of the older cars, they came with these things, rag joints, and it's literally like a rag, and mine have been ripped, gobbled together. And how that works is, it's got two threaded bolts right here, and then it's got the spline part right here. The spline part goes on the steering box, the two bolts go inside of the steering shaft. And if the corner of that rag is ripped, and this thing can just rip itself out like it did, well, that means if you lose that bolt, that means it's not connected to your steering box anymore. And you don't want to be driving down the road, going down the track, and go to make a right turn or something like that, and it don't make no right turn. So I'm replacing this. You know, it's got a lot of play in it. It could rip or break easily like it already did. I'm replacing it with this all steel joints, but it's not exactly the right one for mine. I looked and looked and looked. Believe it or not, I actually tried to go back with just a rag joint, keep it original, but I ordered two that said they were for a 1974 Chevy Nova, and maybe it's not the same steering box, I don't know, but neither one of those things worked. They said they claimed to be one thread count, but anyways. What I'm gonna do is, on the threaded side, still gonna put this threaded side on the gearbox, but I wanted to make sure I have a way that if I put this thing together, I can pull the steering rack out or whatever it may be without having to pull the whole steering box out with it and everything. There's gotta be a way that you can disconnect it. So I've got this tube, and the outside diameter of this tube is actually perfect for the inside tube of the steering rack. So this is going to slide inside of it, and then I'm going to put a bead, I'm going to weld a bead around it to weld this to the steering rack itself. And then on the other end of it, you'll see these things have these little studs with lock nuts on them. I'm going to have this guy go in there. We'll run this out a little bit. I have this guy go in there, and it'll be able to lock down on it. I'm going to drill a hole inside of this so that this bolt has somewhere to go right down in. It'll hold it in place, and it'll also make it where if I need to take it out, I can just back this bolt out and pull the steering shaft out. I got a couple things I'm going to try to get done today. First one is just getting this steering fixed. Once I get the steering fixed, I'm going to get it all the way situated so I don't have to mess with the steering box again. Then I got a new flex plate something that is SFI regulated, and we're going to try to put the transmission and the engine together for the final time. This is a super exciting day. The Nova's going to get the engine, and hopefully it's going to be the last time that I put it in there. It's going to be for final assembly, and then we can start doing some of the other fun stuff. But I'm just super stoked to get the engine and the transmission in the car. So stay tuned, and we're going to get this done. So I was having a little bit of issue here. The steering shaft, where it meets right here, there wasn't enough space in between to fit this. And so I pushed the steering rack back as far as I could, and there still wasn't quite enough space. Then I realized, well, there's these flanges right here that are kind of getting in the way. The thing about that is even if I cut those off and went all the way down to the base where we're welding it in, it still wouldn't have been short enough. So I went inside and I just flipped the mount backwards. So these were right here, now they're further towards the wall. So what it'll allow to do is allow it to move the whole shaft and the steering wheel back a little bit to do two things. It'll mean that I can put the seat farther back, which puts weight farther back in the car, and it also means that I'm gonna have space up front to be able to get everything connected. Just figured I'd show you guys. I've got it marked where I'm gonna run my weld, and then I positioned everything while it was in the car so I could get these holes on the front and side. These little set screws, like little studs, go in there, and screw down into it, lock down on top of these little Allen head, and then you got like a little 9/16 bolt that locks down on it. So well, I'm gonna make a little hole for them to go, so I'm gonna make a hole on the side and on the top. I'm gonna take my little punch. I drilled out the two holes in the pipe that I was going to put on the steering shaft. I test fitted the link, and then I tapped one of the holes, made sure it had threads so that I could lock it down with one of the bolts in place. Then I welded the pipe in place inside of the stock steering column. A quick test fit showed that it was going to work just fine. Once you get this nut loose, this is the steering box, and it comes on most Chevys that probably come from like the 60s all the way through the 80s, I believe. But if you bust that nut loose, you have this adjustment right here to take away some of the play in the box, okay? What this adjustment actually does, there's actually two. A lot of people think it's just this one. This adjusts how far this is engaging. So kind of like your ring and pinion, you got a smaller gear right here and it goes in, and then you got the bigger gear right here and they intertwine. This is actually changing how much bite it's getting, and it feels like mine's been pretty loose, so I'm gonna give it a couple turns. So now that I tightened this bolt down, it pushed it in, made it engage a little bit more. There's very little. I could probably keep going, but the truth is the adjustment needs to be also made by breaking this big bolt loose on the pitman arm, and then actually raising that gear up a little bit as well, possibly filling it with fluid, but I don't feel like doing all that right now. So I just pushed this a little bit more. If you have like a loose steering rack, you might want to try that. And if you have a rag joint, this is how you can put a standard style joint. I'm gonna be installing this Motion Raceworks steam kent. It's supposed to be a much better upgrade for the steam vent than just the stock one, and heck, it looks a whole lot nicer too. It looks like it's pretty simple. These guys right here go in each one of the ports that are already on the head. Sorry, the camera shakes so bad. Yeah, they pop in there, and they come with these little metal gaskets Got a little rubber O-ring built into it. But those guys, they go down in there. And then these things, this end will screw in there. The A end then will go on this. And easy way you can kind of, it tells you that is you see that flare, that cone flare, that's gonna made up with that little cone is what's gonna lock that down. But I'm gonna get to putting this on. So each one of these will connect in. I'm gonna put thread, sealing Teflon tape on each one of these ends. Again, nut on the end for the AEM lines, and I'll start getting everything assembled. Okay, now that I've got the studs tightened down, just hand tight. Now once I've got my block assembled with all 4 angle ports and the straight port in the end, I can go ahead and start assembling my line. Good thing is they actually mark it. So this one says front. So R front. This will be the tube that has nothing on the end of it. That'll be the tube that goes in the end. So I'll start marking up the tube placement. All right, and that is how you assemble a Motion Raceworks vent kit. Now, the next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get this flex plate put on. I ordered one. It is SFI approved, something that'll be a little bit stronger. Figure if you're gonna spend the money on a transmission and try to make some type of power, you don't want this thing, which is probably gonna be one of the hardest things to change once you get everything inside the car, to fail or to have a problem, because it can cause a whole lot of problems if it does fail. But it was less than $100. I got this picked up, and then I got some ARP bolts for it so that they don't break as well. We got a torque converter from FTI, and I got it with the transmission. They made it for the setup that I had. I mean, I haven't got to use it yet, but it's hard for me to say anything bad about these guys. They send bolts, they send the fluid that you need. They're not going to send you some cheap stuff. They make their own. And even if you got a LS, you got a little pilot bearing spacer guide, but they send it all, and I'm excited to find out what it does and what it works like. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get this SFI flex plate installed. I ordered these ARP studs, and the ARP studs, like all ARP stuff, comes with their little fastener lubricant. So get this thing opened and lube these bolts up, start getting them stuck in. It's gonna tell you, thank God, engine side. And this is a dished style flex plate. So these LS engines have a couple different options for flex plates. You have a dish style flex plate. When you use a dish style flex plate, you don't have to use any kind of spacer on it. There's a little ring spacer that will go between these. Sometimes if you're using a flat flex plate and you have a short crank, so you will easily be able to tell, or I don't want to say that because even I got confused, but if it's a short flex plate, it's going to be pretty much almost right in line. Your fingertip is going to catch. If it's a short crank, your fingertip will barely catch. If it's one of the long cranks that came out in 99 to 2001 on the 6.0s, then the crank, you'll have it coming out like a 1/2 inch. It'll be coming out quite a bit more. When you use the 1/2 inch, the long one, you can't use the dished, and you have to use a flat flex plate on the long crank without any spacer. You can't put a spacer on it. In this case, because I have a short crank, I'm going to use the one that is dished. with no spacer. So we'll lube up each one of these bolts. Get them hand tight with the ratchet. And just like wheels, I'm going the cross pattern. Alright, now we gotta grab the torque wrench, and sometimes they give you these things called directions. And it says we gotta torque it to 85 foot-pounds. Our next step, put up a couple tools, and then we'll get some fluid put in the torque converter. When we install this, we're going to be listening for 3 clicks. They'll be very distinct clicks. We'll turn it. Alright, so I'm back out here, and last night I got pretty much everything bolted up with the transmission to the engine. What I did that I didn't get on video is I made sure that I set, let's see if I can get a picture, there we go. So there's what you call pull out, which is a space between the flex plate itself and the torque converter. And what they want is they want you to have, when the torque converter is seated all the way back into the transmission and the flywheel is bolted up to the engine and tightened down, they want you to be able to fit only an 1/8 inch gap in between. So the space from there to the flywheel, they want you to have an 1/8 inch gap. So if you've got a 1/4 inch gap or a 3/4 inch gap or an inch gap, and then you add washers until you only have an 1/8 inch gap. That way when you tighten that bolt down, because when you tighten the bolt down, the flex plate's going to stay in place. It's going to pull the torque converter out. And that's why they call it torque converter pull out. What this does is this keeps it from having a bunch of pressure on the transmission, the pump, and it keeps your pump safe. It also makes sure that you don't ruin the thrust bearing inside of your engine. What I'm going to do real quick is I got a little bit longer bolts for the 2 side bolts on the transmission. I'm going to get those bolted in. With the engine and trans bolted together, it was time for me to start trying to fit this thing back in the car. It's definitely different trying to put an engine and trans in a car by yourself, but I've pulled it out a time or two, and putting it in this time was a little bit easier because I'd done it before. The hardest part of the install was just getting the driver's side engine mount to line up so that I could fit the bolt through. Okay, now that I've got it down, set it down. It took me a little bit to get motor mounts in and everything, but we got them in, the bolts, and got them tightened down. But made a little mistake. So when I was getting this thing dropped down in, I guess I used a different bolt last time because this guy backed up right against the firewall. And I think what I'm just gonna do is I'm gonna break it loose with a wrench and then death wheel. I'm gonna cut it off, cut the rest of it off, and then grab it with some vice grips and back the rest of it off. Hopefully by cutting the head off of it, I'll have enough room to get it all the way out. But we'll see.
And victory. I cut the head of the bolt off and was able to release the engine from the hoist. With that, the engine was installed and freedom bells rang.